Investigations have revealed that Indian diplomats and consular officials based in Canada leveraged their official position to engage in clandestine activities, such as collecting information for the government of India, either directly or through their agents, and other individuals who acted voluntarily or through coercion.
No country, particularly not a democracy that upholds the rule of law, can accept this fundamental violation of its sovereignty. Canada fully accepts and respects the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of India. We expect India to do the same.
Serious accusations levied this week against the Indian government, with the RCMP alleging the involvement of Indian government agents in violent crimes here in Canada as part of investigations into crimes and threats targeting the South Asian community, telling Canadians yesterday that in the past year they've warned more than a dozen people in this country of threats to their lives. The RCMP announcing that after a series of investigations, they've charged 8 people in relation to murder investigations and 22 others in extortion cases, and that some of those individuals have connections to the government of India. The government responding, expelling 6 Indian diplomats, including India's High Commissioner in Ottawa, saying they are persons of interest in criminal investigations and are refusing to cooperate with law enforcement. India responded, denying those allegations explicitly and expelling themselves 6 Canadian diplomats, including our most senior one in that country. The U.S. State Department this afternoon weighing in.
The allegations are extremely serious, and they need to be taken seriously, and we wanted to see the government of India cooperate with Canada in its investigation. Obviously, they have not chosen that path.
With us now to unpack the significance of the allegations and where things go from here, the former head of Canada's spy agency, CSIS, Ward Elcock, and former National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, Vincent Rigby. Hello to both of you. Thank you very much for making the time. Professor Rigby, I'll start with you, and I just wanted to ask you, the U.S. did weigh in today. The State Department spokesperson spoke. We aired a little bit of it, essentially, refraining from responding too much to what exactly India has said or not said so far, but being very explicit that they would like to see India cooperate. How do you interpret that?
Well, I think this is going to be the big question going forward, to the extent to which Five Eyes allies, and particularly the United States, do take a more active role in trying to sort out this problem. So it's nice to see that the United States has come out and basically said they would have liked India to perhaps had a slightly different response than the one that they've had up to this point. But in my own view, if this is going to get solved over the longer term, the United States is going to have to play a very proactive role. Whether you want to call it mediate, whether you want to call it a little bit of pushing and prodding, I'm not sure. But obviously, the United States has an interest in 2 of its allies not getting along. And so you would hope that they do step forward.
Do you think there is a sort of mediator role that the U.S. could play here, Mr. Elcock?
I doubt that it's a mediator role, but I think, as Vincent alluded to, it likely will be only solved if the United States plays a role in pushing the Indians into some sort of movement. At this point, the Indians have staked out a position which is essentially means it's almost impossible to find a solution to the problem between us and India.
You, of course, I'm just going to follow up with you, Mr. Elcock, before moving back to Mr. Rigby. You've been involved in national security for decades at this point. How significant do you think it was that the RCMP leveraged these or came out with these allegations in the fashion that they did, in the middle of, essentially, of these investigations? It's not something we normally see.
It's not something we normally see, but in the circumstances that have been described, it makes a whole lot of sense. The reality is the RCMP appear to have information that the Indian diplomats were involved. They asked the Indians to waive immunity, a diplomatic immunity. The Indians refused. There's no other option but to expel the people from the country. And at the same time, the RCMP wanted to send a message that that kind of activity on the part of diplomats targeting Canadians, possibly even killing Canadians, was unacceptable, and the only way you can do that is by making public some of the information. But you can't make too much public because you're facing a bunch of criminal trials, and you don't want to damage those trials by releasing too much information. So they've released a little bit. They've released enough to get rid of, to force the Indians off the pitch. But at the end of the day, preserved enough so we don't really know entirely what's going on until we see the trials.
I think one of the most shocking elements of what the RCMP conveyed to Canadians yesterday, Mr. Professor Rigby, was around the involvement, of course, of the agents of the Indian government, the diplomats, essentially, who were here. I think to the average Canadian like myself, that is surprising. To someone who has been involved in security and intelligence, is that surprising to you?
Well, I think that there have long been suspicions that the Indian government was involved in foreign interference activities in Canada. And, you know, as we've seen this controversy over foreign interference with respect to China in particular play out over the last couple of years, India has been named as a perpetrator of foreign interference in this country. So foreign interference is one thing in the context of electoral interference and those kinds of things. But when you've got an allegation that actual diplomats in the Indian embassy may have been complicit in murder, in extortion, in intimidation, that's another level of foreign interference. And I think this is very, very serious. And of course, it begs the question that if the High Commissioner himself was involved in some of these activities, who is he getting orders from? And so does this go right back to New Delhi? And was he possibly getting instructions to move forward? If not, then he'd be a rogue element. It's a rogue element. I would question, and I've already seen this reporting out today from some news outlets that this probably can be traced all the way back to New Delhi. So we'll see how that plays out in the coming days and weeks.
Mr. Elcock, there's also, you know, the sort of discernible difference with which India is treating allegations, not of a completely similar nature, but certainly the allegation, for example, it was involved in attempted murder in the United States, how it's sort of navigating that case and that relationship versus how it's navigating this case and these cases and the relationship with Canada. Why do you think that difference exists?
I think the easiest answer and the most likely answer is likely that the United States is a good deal more important in the world than we are. And the reality is we are, in the scheme of things, from the Indian point of view, relatively a bit player. So they're reacting much more positively to the Americans, but they're not actually reacting entirely positively to the Americans. I mean, they basically have responded to the Americans by appointing a commission to inquire into the affair. And so far as I've seen, they've really only indicated that, yes, they found out that people were doing things improperly, and they're going to deal with those issues. But will they ever submit somebody to U.S. justice? I doubt it very much.
Professor Rigby, what are your thoughts on the difference with which, or maybe perhaps lack thereof, the cases are being handled?
No, I think that Ward's hit the nail on the head. We're not a great power at the end of the day, and I think that India feels that they probably can bully Canada a little bit more than they can the United States. So again, different order of magnitude. Canada is not the United States, so they're going to play that relationship a little bit differently. But let's not forget something, that the fact of the matter is that we do have evidence that the Indian government may have been complicit in an assassination attempt of a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil. So yes, their response has been a little bit different, and maybe they responded a little bit better to the American allegations. But the bottom line is they also tried to kill somebody in the United States. They were successful in Canada, not as far as we can tell in the United States. So they are flexing their muscles. They are asserting their ambitions. They feel that Sikh extremism and Sikh terrorism is an existential threat to the Indian state. So they are reaching out, and they're being very, very aggressive.
I wanted to follow up quickly with you, Professor Rigby, on that point, because I think that is the sort of background context to a lot of why India says they're responding in the way they are, right? This accusation that Canada has become, and this is their accusation, certainly not backed up by any evidence I've seen, but Canada has become this sort of safe haven for Sikh extremism. I interviewed the High Commissioner months ago who raised the specter of that on this program as well. What is are those concerns founded in any way, do you think?
Well, it's a good question. I remember your interview with the Indian High Commissioner those months ago, and I did find his answers were interesting. So the Indian government will continue to complain that the Canadian government does not take Sikh extremism seriously, and that they're not doing enough to basically put this back in the jar, so to speak. But no matter what they may feel that the Canadian government isn't doing enough, that they're not coming down on Sikh extremism or Sikh terrorism, this does not justify when they're not happy to reach out and, so it is alleged, basically support extrajudicial and extraterritorial killings and intimidation on the soil of another sovereign state. I mean, that's not the way democracies are supposed to treat other democracies. We know that there is a Sikh extremism in this country. We know that certainly this has been an issue in Canada. But for the Indian government to have taken these extreme measures is clearly beyond the pale, and they've crossed a red line.
Last word to you, Mr. Elcock. It's sort of a unique situation in which we're not talking about an adversary like Iran or like China or like Russia. We're talking about someone who's supposed to be, as Mr. Rigby said, another democracy. How difficult does that make for countries like Canada, but also the United States, as both of you pointed out? How difficult does it make it to navigate this sort of complexity, for lack of a better way of describing it?
It makes it complicated, particularly because there are a bunch of objectives vis-a-vis India, both in terms of the relationship with China, in terms of trade in the future. It's a growing power. It will be a world power in the future. So it does make the world much more complicated. But the reality is we're dealing with a government which has shown signs of being not particularly democratic in the last while. And fairly autocratic. I mean, Mr. Modi himself has demonstrated a fairly autocratic style for a fairly long time, and a style which includes religious extremism aimed at anybody else other than the Hindus within India. India is appears to be a good deal less democratic than it was, but it does make it much more complicated that it is in a sense one of our own, one of the other democracies that is behaving in this way.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Thank you very much, both of you, for the analysis this evening. I appreciate it. Ward Elcock and Vincent Rigby.